What's the best way to use a bow at close range? For thousands of years, bows dominated ranged weapon technology, and when your enemy's all the way over there, they're absolutely fantastic. But it's generally acknowledged that they become a bit less good when your enemy's within make-out range, which is why archers throughout history tended to carry at least one backup weapon, and possibly also a shield. But fictional characters very often either don't carry a backup or rarely use it. For a lot of characters, their primary equipment set is as much a part of their identity as their costume or their hair, and switching them out on a regular basis can make them feel ill-defined. So instead, fictional archers find weird and wonderful ways of using their bows, even in scenarios where it doesn't make sense. From backup unarmed strikes, to using the bow or even the arrows as melee weapons, to rapid shots at close range, to acrobatic dodge moves, literally anything to avoid actually having to draw a sword. But would any of these tactics actually work? And were any of them used historically? In this video, I'm going to break down why you can't just use a bow normally in melee, talk about some of the alternatives, and then break down what works and what doesn't. It is hot today, and with the sun beating down and the ground completely dry, tactics that once seemed like a good idea can start to feel a bit silly. In the real world, warriors from hot areas often wore looser clothing and travelled lighter than their temperate counterparts, and in many cases preferred fast movement and skirmishing tactics over prolonged open warfare. And while these are just generalizations, it's only logical that a story set in a hot climate that takes inspiration from cultures like the Ottomans is going to feel different from a regular medieval fantasy. Set in the fiery continent of Idahar in the last days of a huge trade empire, Pilgrims of the Empire's End is a massive expansion book to D&D 5th edition. Packed with over 15 new subclasses, including a rogue snake charmer, a monk that gains bonuses by spinning through combat, and a barbarian who grows thorns from their body to harm opponents, new rule sets for awakening items, fighting giant enemies, and much, much more. So if you're looking to boost your next D&D campaign and you're a fan of Dune, the Ottoman Empire, or snakes with magic hands, check out Pilgrims of the Empire's End. And if you want to find out more, there's a free downloadable preview on the Kickstarter page, which you can find in the link below. First off, let's discuss the elephant in the room. Why can't you just use your bow normally at close range? This is a question that dungeon masters and players of a lot of turn-based games will be very familiar with. And the answer is that you can. There's nothing inherently wrong with using a bow at close range. As long as my arrow can clear the bow, it will do as much damage from here as it would from over here. So why do so many games penalize you for making shots right up close? The answer is less about the shooting and more about everything else. Drawing, knocking, and shooting an arrow requires space and both of my hands. I can't do it as easily if I'm trying to dodge, block, or otherwise parry, and that's going to slow down my rate of shooting. And while I can in theory shoot normally from here, if, as I'm trying to shoot, my enemy steps into my range, then I can't actually get the arrow all the way back. I'm probably going to get clocked in the head while I'm doing it. Plus, if I've knocked my arrow and my enemy wants to disrupt my shot, all they really have to do is that. So when a game penalizes you for using bows close up, it's often less about the physical practicalities of the bow and more about the physical practicalities of shooting arrows while surrounded by enemies and in the middle of a fight. There's also the obvious game balance reasons, but that's not really applicable to this video. So, if using a bow in melee leaves me vulnerable, but I don't want to switch weapons, what are my options? The first is to shoot quickly. Popular in settings where your enemies drop instantly to a single arrow, rapid shooting allows you to take down close-range enemies before they have a chance to hit you. But how reliable would this be? According to reports and Danish archer Lars Andersen, the fastest archers could shoot an arrow every 0.5 seconds, which is a lot faster than this. But a melee weapon can do the same without needing to reload. It's also worth noting that these kind of speeds often require advanced setup, making sure the arrows are lined up correctly in the hand so you don't have to fumble with them. Not to mention, they're often done at partial draw, which reduces the penetration you get if your enemies are wearing armor. So if you're just grabbing arrows from a quiver, or you're trying to hit a longer draw to get more power from the bow, it's gonna slow things down a bit. But that's not the real killer for this technique. Because even if you can reliably shoot arrows at that speed at full power, there's no guarantee that any individual arrow is going to instantly drop somebody. The human body varies massively in its resilience, and sometimes someone could take multiple arrows and keep fighting, and sometimes someone will fall to a single one. But if your enemy is within melee range of you, and they're already carrying a weapon, would you stake your life on the principle that they're going to fall straight away? I know I wouldn't. So, while rapid shooting looks incredibly cool in films, and was a genuine historical technique that had a place on the battlefield for launching vast number of arrows in a short space of time, preferably while moving quickly on horseback, as a technique for holding off enemies at melee range, it's probably not ideal. But what about acrobatics? After all, if the problem with rapid shooting is that your enemies can still close you down, if you can keep well out of their reach and hit them from a distance, then you've sort of solved the problem. And actually, it's not a bad idea. In fact, it's very, very similar from what a lot of horseback archers did throughout history. The idea that being more agile than your opponent and having better range than them allowed you to stay out of their reach, pepper them with arrows from a distance, and never let them close. So as long as you actually are faster and more agile than your opponent, then running and dodging and keeping them at bay is definitely a viable technique. And after you've hit them with a couple of arrows and they've started bleeding, they'll slow down, and you've got an even better chance to get away. But repeatedly doing acrobatics is much more tiring than regular fighting. And the reason you don't see many dodge rolls in martial arts tournaments is that they're actually kind of easy to track and hit. So if your enemy's already close up, it's probably going to leave you more vulnerable than attempting something else to hold them at bay. But if you're only doing this in the short term and you can combine it with something that gives you time to make your escape, then it might be a viable way to hold an enemy off for a few seconds while you land those crucial hits. And even if it's not, it continues to look cool in fiction. Which brings me neatly round to unarmed strikes. These are actually used surprisingly rarely by fictional archers, who tend to prefer whacking things with the bow to applying a kick. But in theory, if you can get a decent kick in, it leaves your arms open to get your next shot lined up. Meaning that it's a pretty valid way to hold someone at bay, or even take someone out before making your next shot. Historically speaking, grappling, wrestling, and unarmed strikes formed an important part of a soldier's training, and would often be a backup for after everything else had gone to shit. And again, if you've still got arrows in your quiver, and your plan is to get back to ranged combat, then that simple strike or shove might buy you the space to get into it. But if you're using a bow, chances are your enemies are also armed. And unarmed combat, while very effective against other unarmed opponents, is not necessarily as useful when they've got a sword. The superior reach, damage, and defensive capability of even a relatively straightforward melee weapon put you at a severe disadvantage fighting unarmed. And while an unexpected grab or strike can be a useful supplement in armed combat, if you rely on them too heavily, your enemy can just stay at a distance and pick off your limbs as they come close. But, I hear you cry, I'm not actually unarmed. I'm an archer. I've got this big stick in my hand and a whole bunch of pointy things on my back that I can use to mess somebody up. Which is technically true. A bow, even a short one like this, has much better reach than I have with my fist alone. And an arrow is similar, while also being pointy and disposable. So once again, if my enemies are getting close, and I, for whatever reason, don't want to draw a backup, then taking one of these out and using it to stab for the eyes and make them flinch long enough to be able to land a shot, and taking this thing and hooking a neck or a limb, again, might buy me the space that I need to be an archer. But once again, if I'm staying in melee, its uses are limited. Arrows, while much better than nothing, are still a relatively thin and lightweight bit of metal. They've got no defensive features, and they're hard to hold in a secure grip. So against something like a sword, it's going to get whacked aside, it's going to be hard to parry, and it's probably going to get broken. Which is fine, because I've got more of them. But sooner or later, drawing more arrows is either going to run me out of arrows, or leave me vulnerable in the time in between. And a bow, while an appreciable stick, is pretty lightweight compared with a club or a staff or something else you'd want to whack someone with. When you shoot a bow, it's not just the arrow, but also the ends of the bow that move. So they are, by design, pretty lightweight out towards the edge, with most of the mass concentrated in the middle, which is good for archery, but it's not good for smacking things. Like the arrow, they completely lack any kind of defensive feature, leaving you very open to a sword strike that slides down and hits your hand. And even if it doesn't, a strike that hits the string or heavily damages the limb is going to render your bow inoperable when you come to shoot. At best, you won't be able to use it, and at worst, it will explode in your face and actually damage you. All of which is to say that neither a bow nor an arrow is a particularly good long-term viable alternative to an actual melee weapon. But, as with everything else, if someone's up close and they're about to get you, and you can get them first with one of these, or one of these, or one of these, or something like this, then anything that buys you that time, saves your life, and allows you to keep on going is much, much better than nothing. And actually, if you're looking to design an archer that's visually dynamic but still feels vaguely grounded, then combining everything so far would give you an archer that uses longer shots at longer range, switches to rapid shots at mid-range, uses acrobatics to gain and close distance, and then switches to unarmed strikes, arrow stabs, grappling, and bows to create the space to make that final shot. And I think that would be pretty cool. It's nowhere near as realistic as having a viable melee setup, but it allows you to stay true to your original character's design and create somebody that feels just that bit more skilled than their opponents without using tactics that are completely out of the realms of viability. But so far, everything I've discussed has relied on two primary assumptions. The first is that you're using a regular unmodified bow and arrows, and the second is that you would rather get back to the longer range and shoot arrows again than stay in melee. But what if neither of those is true? What if once you get into melee, you're happy to stay there and you're willing to modify your bow to make that work? Well, in that case, you might want something like this. This is my home improvised version of a hazuyari, or a spear bow, or a bow spear, or a bow lance, or one of the handful of weird and wonderful variations of bow and spear that have existed throughout history. This particular one is made from a Chinese war bow, which is relatively short by the standards of the versions of these that existed. But what it does is it turns my bow into something that can still launch arrows effectively, but can then charge an enemy and stab them. It overcomes some of the main flaws of using a bow as a striking weapon, which is mainly that you're risking a lot of damage to the structure of the bow. But if I'm stabbing with it, then I'm actually not doing that. I'm piling a lot of the weight in a direction that the bow is already designed to resist pressure from, and most of the force and the initial impact is going via the blade, which I've attached to the end. If I'm caught unawares at close range, it's still quicker to switch to than an actual melee weapon. But now, instead of just trying to buy myself some space, I could potentially actually use it to end the fight. And if, as many of these were, I attach this to the end of an actual longbow, then it will also give me a decent amount of reach, potentially even rivaling that of a spear, which might mean that even if I do have a sword, I might use this initially until things get a little more close and I can come in with the blade. The designs for these varied a little bit, but generally speaking, they followed similar principles. They were usually used on the end of a relatively long bow, and they tended to have a very lightweight and relatively small blade, which kept the weight down on the ends of the limbs and allowed the bow to function mostly as normal. The combination of reach, speed, and of course the fact that you can continue to use them as a ranged weapon means that they had some use in various societies as a backup. But they're not a perfect hybrid. Adding any amount of weight to the end of one of the limbs can affect the way the shot flies. In this case, my top limb is now moving slower than my bottom one, and it tends to make my arrows fly a little bit high. Secondly, as I continue striking with this thing, if I want to block any attacks and it's still strung, I'm still risking damage to the bow itself and still risking it potentially breaking on me, which, if that happened here, would cause this limb to catapult into my stomach and cause me quite a lot of discomfort. As a spear, the curved design is awkward but not impossible to manage, but the lightweight head means that it's got a limited amount of slashing power and also prevents you from adding any kind of extra defensive capabilities like you'd find, say, on a winged spear or something like that. You're also limited by the length of the bow and the sturdiness of it. This has a draw of over 100 pounds, and so it doesn't wobble too much when you strike with it, but it's still not a particularly solid bit of kit, all of which contribute to these being relatively rare. In cultures where the archers would fight on foot, with a group of foot soldiers out in front of them, they probably weren't necessary, and you'd be much better off carrying a proper dedicated melee and a proper dedicated bow. In cultures where you do your archery from horseback and your aim is to create as much space as possible, again, you can have a proper melee weapon on your horse, so it's a lot easier and a lot less necessary for something like this. And finally, if you're fighting a lot of heavily armed and armoured opponents, it probably isn't going to be that much more useful than the regular bow, and you're still going to need to switch to something else as quickly as possible. But in skirmishing combat, where ranges change quickly, where you're running about a lot and so are your enemies, where you don't have formalized lines and you're quite likely to get snuck up on and taken by surprise, if you're out hunting and you might just need to fend off an animal that's that bit quicker than you can shoot, or if you're a D&D adventurer and you're used to fighting in caves and close spaces, then something like this could be a genuinely useful bit of kit. So there we have it. If you're an archer, don't let your enemies get too close. If you can't help it, make sure you've got a backup. And if you don't want to carry one of those, combining different techniques to allow you to buy space and time to continue shooting arrows is probably your best bet. But if you think that's going to be happening a lot, get yourself one of these babies. I hope you found that interesting, or at the very least entertaining. If you like these videos and you want to support them, please consider subscribing to my Patreon. We've got tutorials, art references, and all sorts of nonsense over there. Please check out our sponsors, Pilgrims of the Empire's End. And if you want to see more of this stuff, or you think there's something that I missed, let me know. Finally, I just want to give one last honourable mention to one technique that has been used throughout history for archers to keep their melee enemies at bay, and that is the bring a mate option. If you have a trained wolf or a trained boar that can attack your enemies close up and keep them busy while you pepper them with arrows, then in a fantasy setting, that is absolutely fantastic. And it is, of course, very similar to what a lot of hunting parties have done using trained dogs. However, my dog is not that well trained, so I haven't been able to use him for this, and I don't want to risk shooting him. That's it for this video. See you on the next one.